In a forgotten archive lit by a single trembling bulb, a lone historian uncovers a portrait that defies every boundary of its era, revealing a quiet boy whose presence in the frame challenges everything men once believed unbreakable. His pale face stands among darker brothers, a contrast so dangerous that entire communities once risked their lives to shield him, protect him, and bury the truth beneath layers of dust, silence, and iron-forged loyalty. Yet the photograph survived, untouched, unburned, unclaimed, waiting for the one man willing to follow its thread into the past, where devotion between men carried mortal stakes, and a single choice forged the path for generations to come. What he uncovers isn't merely a mystery, but a legacy tempered by danger and honor, a testament to how far a man will go to guard a son who was never meant to be seen. If a single photograph can rewrite a century of silence, imagine what the full story can do. Stay with this journey. Let it pull you into the forgotten spaces where loyalty outweighed fear, where men chose honor over survival, and where one hidden son reshaped everything that followed. The basement archive breathed stale air as a lone historian moved through its shadows, his lantern glow catching dust that floated like forgotten memories. He had no idea one photograph would overturn everything he understood about loyalty between men. He reached for an unlabeled box with the hesitation of someone sensing a threshold, the cardboard soft from age, its silence pressing against him like a warning. Inside waited a single portrait, rigidly framed, impossibly well preserved. The photograph showed four men seated in formal posture, each wearing the sharp discipline of a bygone era, their expressions steady and unreadable. Yet a young boy stood among them, out of place in ways that grated against the logic of the time. The boy's skin was pale in contrast to the darker men around him. His eyes held a brightness that didn't match their hardened focus. Nothing in the composition felt accidental, yet nothing about his presence made sense. No records he'd studied mentioned such a household. No guardianship, no adoption, no wardship documentation. The photograph itself felt like a contradiction intentionally hidden, as though it carried a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. He flipped the frame and found a date etched lightly into the wood, March 1920. Beneath it, 5 names appeared, carved with a confident hand. For belonged to the men he recognized, the boy's name was entirely unfamiliar. A tremor of curiosity pushed through his caution. Why had these 4 men, brothers by posture if not blood, risked documenting a boy whose presence would have defied every law of their world? Why immortalize something forbidden? He carried the photograph toward a desk, the lamplight washing across the boy's face, revealing faint scarring beneath the left eye. That mark spoke of conflict, perhaps violence, perhaps rescue. It was the first breadcrumb in a buried trail. He traced the etching of the eldest man's name, recalling fragments of records mentioning a disciplined carpenter admired for leadership. Yet no archive hinted he ever raised or sheltered a son outside his lineage. The historian felt the familiar pull of a mystery tightening around him, a quiet grip that demanded pursuit. This was no trivial family artifact. It was evidence of a bond men once protected with their lives. He opened an old census ledger, scanning entries under the men's surnames. Their names appeared cleanly, precisely, consistently, but always without the boy. Not a single mention, as if the youngest figure had been deliberately erased. He flipped page after page, searching for anomalies, absences, contradictions. The boy's name never surfaced. Records of the era were strict, but this absence was too perfect, too polished, too intentional to be coincidence. He leaned back, breath steadying as a realization sharpened inside him. Someone had invested great effort to bury the boy's existence. Someone who feared the consequences of truth becoming visible. The lantern flickered, casting shifting shadows on the portrait. In that trembling light, the boy's posture seemed subtly different, closer to the man beside him, almost leaning into him. A gesture of trust, dependency, a son's instinct seeking safety. The historian's pulse tightened. Whatever bound these men together was deeper than law, deeper than blood, deeper than the era's rigid barriers. Something had forced them into an impossible decision. He gathered additional documents from the box, receipts, letters, fragments of ledgers, each aged, each incomplete. But one scrap of paper stood out, a wallet-sized note written in a child's clumsy hand, bearing only a single word, Remember. The simplicity of it cut through him. Remember what? Remember who? Remember why? It was less a message than a plea carved into time, urging whoever found it to continue the story left unfinished. He knew, with certainty now, that he stood at the entrance of a truth shaped by danger. Men don't hide nothingness. They hide what matters too much to lose. And this photograph mattered far more than any forgotten artifact. The historian closed the box gently, as though afraid the silence inside might shatter. His breath frosted the air, though the room was not cold. Fear and anticipation twisted together, a warning wrapped in invitation. He stepped back toward the portrait, studying the placement of hands. One man's palm rested firmly on the boy's shoulder, claiming him with a quiet authority that felt earned, protective, possibly defiant. This single touch implied a decision that could have cost these men everything. The portrait wasn't about the boy alone. It was a declaration of responsibility in a world that punished such choices brutally. The historian realized the men had paid for a professional portrait despite the risk. That meant intention, documentation, a message for the future, a record they needed someone, anyone, to find someday. He pressed the photograph against his chest, grounding himself. He had uncovered the surface, but the deeper story lived elsewhere, buried in forgotten ledgers and cracked foundations where the truth had been exiled. A faint hum shivered through the room, as if the building itself remembered what he couldn't yet see. He wasn't chasing a ghost. He was awakening a legacy built on courage, quiet defiance, and unspoken brotherhood. His mind raced with connections, names, dates, missing entries, unfiled reports. Something catastrophic must have happened to necessitate such secrecy. A threat so great it reshaped the lives of every man in that portrait. The historian returned to his lantern, lighting it brighter. The growing glow reflected in the boy's eyes within the frame, making him appear unexpectedly alive, as though waiting for someone to finally understand. He whispered into the quiet, unsure why his voice dropped to reverence. "I'll find you." It was a promise born from instinct rather than logic, a vow to unravel the silence forged around this forgotten son. He collected his tools, securing the portrait under protective cloth. The air felt taut with pressure, as though he had disturbed something meant to sleep. Yet he sensed no malice, only urgency. He climbed the stairs out of the archive, each step echoing like a heartbeat, carrying a story abandoned for a century. The weight he held was not just a photograph. It was a truth demanding resurrection. When he reached the cold night air, the historian understood the stakes ahead. This wasn't merely research. It was testimony. And once he began, there would be no turning back from the shadows waiting to be confronted. The portrait throbbed against his side as though alive with consequence. Somewhere in the past, for men had shielded a boy from forces that would have crushed him. Now the historian bore the responsibility of exposing their sacrifice. A storm gathered overhead, the wind rattling the streetlights. Nature seemed to echo the tension of what he carried, urging him forward. This story wanted out. It had waited long enough. He tightened his grip, heart steadying with purpose. The journey to decode this hidden lineage would test him in ways he couldn't foresee. But he owed it to the unnamed boy to continue. He stepped into the night, unaware that the truth he sought would soon entangle him with descendants who had lived generations shaped by a choice their fathers took to the grave, a choice that would soon reshape his world. The past opened like a wound the moment the historian traced the oldest man's name, uncovering fragments of a life shaped by hardship, craftsmanship, and the quiet authority earned only by a man others trusted without hesitation. He learned the carpenter had lived in a district where neighbors survived by leaning on one another, men building strength through shared labor, shared struggle, and the understanding that loyalty among them mattered more than law or reputation. In this world, the carpenter was known for taking younger apprentices under his wing, guiding boys who had lost fathers or brothers, teaching them trades that forged discipline and purpose in a society determined to break them. One cold winter morning in early 1920, he discovered a young boy sitting alone on the remains of a burned-down shack, clutching a scorched wooden toy as if it were the last piece of his world worth holding. The carpenter approached cautiously, sensing a depth of shock in the boy's stare that no words could reach. The ash-covered ground whispered of catastrophe. The boy's trembling breath revealed he had witnessed more than any child should. The man knelt beside him, recognizing something familiar. a loneliness carved by loss, the hollow ache of someone who had outlived his fathers, brothers, and protectors. He didn't ask questions. He simply rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch. He leaned slightly toward the touch, a trusting instinct born from desperation. In that small movement, the carpenter understood the silent plea, "Don't leave me here." Taking the boy home was not an impulsive act. It was a decision forged from the carpenter's core belief that a man must protect the vulnerable, even if the world punished him for it. News of the fire spread quickly, and with it the rumor that county officials intended to seize the boy and send him to a notoriously harsh boys' facility where discipline meant brutality and survival meant submission. The carpenter gathered with two trusted neighbors that night, men who had stood beside him in hardship, men with whom he'd shared sweat, hunger, and the fierce bond formed in the crucible of survival. They spoke quietly in the carpenter's dim workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and oil. The boy slept nearby on a cot, exhausted from grief, unaware that his future was being forged by three men at a simple wooden table. Each man understood the risk of interfering with county authority. Challenging the system meant retaliation, fines, imprisonment, or worse. But leaving the boy to the mercy of that institution felt like a betrayal of their shared code. The carpenter's closest comrade slammed a fist onto the table, not in anger, but in conviction. "We protect our own," he said. "If the boy has no fathers left, then we become them." Silence followed, not hesitation, but agreement. It was a vow exchanged without ceremony, strengthened by the unspoken understanding that once made, it bound them together for life. They spent the next days creating a cover story, one that might hold under scrutiny. The boy would be introduced as a distant relative visiting to learn a trade, a quiet apprentice, a temporary addition to the household. The carpenter taught the boy to sand wood, guiding his small hands along the grain. Each motion brought steadiness, as if the craft itself stitched fragments of the boy's shattered world back into place. Despite his pale skin and unfamiliar features, the boy blended into the workshop rhythm. He mimicked the men's gestures, mirrored their discipline, and clung to the carpenter's side with a reverence usually reserved for blood bonds. But whispers spread faster than the truth. Neighbors questioned the boy's sudden appearance, and county officials began circling the district, sensing something concealed beneath the surface of daily routine. One afternoon, the boy was nearly discovered when an inspector entered the workshop unexpectedly. The carpenter stepped between them, blocking the inspector's view, pretending to discuss lumber prices while the boy hid behind stacked crates. The inspector left unsatisfied, promising to return. The air thickened with tension. The men convened again that night, their shared fear igniting a deeper resolve rather than deterring them. "It's only a matter of time," the carpenter said, his voice steady but weighted. "We need proof that he belongs with us, something undeniable, something permanent." His eyes drifted toward the portrait studio across town. A portrait would cement the boy's place among them. A declaration carved in light and shadow. A message for the future stating these men stood for him when no one else dared to. The idea was reckless, dangerous. A photograph was evidence in a world where evidence could destroy them. Yet the men agreed unanimously. If they were to be punished, let history at least know why they acted. On the day of the portrait, the boy wore a freshly brushed coat, standing between the men who had pledged to shield him. The photographer, a quiet man with a soldier's posture, sensed the gravity of the moment without asking questions. The carpenter placed his hand on the boy's shoulder with the certainty of a father claiming his son. The boy straightened, pride flickering through him for the first time since the fire stole his family. When the shutter clicked, the air seemed to hold its breath. The men understood they were capturing not just an image, but a defiance that could outlive them if fate allowed the photograph to survive. Afterward, they hid the portrait in a reinforced wooden chest beneath the workshop floor, hoping time would protect what the law would condemn. The boy touched the carpenter's hand, silently thanking him without needing words. Days turned to weeks, and the men monitored every sound outside their homes, every unfamiliar footstep, every official carriage rumbling down the street. The threat never left, it only learned to linger. The boy grew stronger, quicker with tools, more confident beside the men who had taught him structure and purpose. He was no longer the trembling child found in the ashes. He was becoming a son forged from brotherhood. But tension reached a breaking point when officials returned with sharper questions and hardened expressions. Something had alerted them, perhaps a slip, perhaps a rumor, perhaps envy. The men knew the walls were closing in. They met in the workshop once more, the lantern's glow flickering across their grim faces. The carpenter studied the boy, who worked quietly nearby, unaware his fate was being debated again. "We can't protect him here anymore," one man said. "If they take him now, everything we've done becomes meaningless." The carpenter nodded, his jaw tight. The time for decision had come. Their choice would shape generations, though none of them knew it yet. They would send the boy away under concealment, placing him in the care of a trusted comrade in a distant city where officials held less sway. The carpenter knelt beside the boy that night, tracing a small emblem he had carved onto the boy's wooden toy. "Keep this," he whispered. "It means you belong to men who will always stand for you." The boy didn't cry. He simply wrapped his arms around the man who had become his protector, trusting him the way a son trusts the one who teaches him how to stand, how to hold steady in a storm. As dawn approached, the boy departed with another guardian, vanishing into the roads before officials could arrive. The carpenter watched him disappear, feeling both relief and a hollow ache only fathers know. Back in the workshop, the men stood silently around the empty cot. No words could soften the sacrifice they had made. Their courage had saved the boy, but cost them a piece of their own hearts. The portrait beneath the floor remained untouched, a secret testament to the brotherhood that had defied an era. The carpenter sealed it away, praying that someday someone worthy would find it and understand. The boy's disappearance echoed through the district like a quiet fracture, spoken only in guarded whispers among the men who had shielded him. His absence carried weight, a hollow reminder of the danger they'd challenged and the bond they'd forged. In the workshop, the carpenter returned to his bench each morning, gripping tools that once steadied the boy's trembling hands. The familiar grain felt different now, as if the wood mourned the apprentice who learned to breathe again under its dust. The men kept their routine unchanged, maintaining the illusion that nothing had happened. Yet each hammer strike felt heavier, each sunrise a reminder of a choice that saved a life but fractured the world they knew. Officials continued searching, unaware the boy was far beyond their reach. The carpenter responded with calm answers, feigning ignorance with the same discipline he used to shape timber: precise, controlled, impossible to splinter. Despite the outward calm, he sensed unseen eyes studying him. The era punished defiance, and the men knew they had challenged a system that required obedience. They prepared for consequences that never fully arrived but always hovered like a blade above their shoulders. The carpenter found himself carving more often, shaping wooden figures late into the night. He sculpted quiet symbols of the boy's spirit, small tokens of resilience that made the empty workshop feel less silent, less abandoned. One evening, while finishing a small wooden crest, he realized the boy had changed him, not through blood, but through trust, through the unspoken recognition that men sometimes find sons by circumstance rather than lineage. The boy's guardian in the distant city sent a coded letter weeks later, confirming safe arrival. The message contained few details, but the carpenter read between the lines. The boy was alive, learning, healing. The carpenter held the letter to his chest, allowing himself one exhale of relief before burning it in the workshop stove. No evidence could remain, not in a world that punished compassion disguised as defiance. Life continued, but nothing felt the same. The men had shared an ordeal that forever bound them, a truth hidden beneath everyday gestures. When they met, they exchanged brief nods carrying the weight of unsaid gratitude and shared fear. The carpenter's comrades sometimes asked whether the boy would remember them. The carpenter always answered the same way. A son remembers the hands that lifted him when the world collapsed beneath him. The men believed him because they needed to. Years passed with quiet resilience. The district slowly forgot the scandal, shifting its suspicion toward other rumors, other targets. But the carpenter never forgot the boy's wide, uncertain eyes searching for safety in a world that gave him none. The portrait remained hidden beneath the workshop floor, untouched, sealed in time. The carpenter rarely looked at it, fearing the memories it might unearth. Yet its presence beneath his feet anchored him, reminding him the truth waited patiently. Rumors eventually surfaced of a young apprentice thriving in a northern city, known for discipline, sharp instincts, and loyalty to the men who taught him to work with his hands. The carpenter heard these tales in passing and recognized the echoes of lessons he once gave. He never traveled to see the boy. Trusting distance kept him safe. Still, the idea of his son by choice walking a new path filled him with a solemn pride he never admitted aloud. One winter, a traveler visiting the district brought news of a young man who carried a wooden emblem identical to the one the carpenter carved. The description alone tightened something deep within the carpenter's chest. The traveler said the young man spoke often of mentors from a faraway district, men who had taught him to stand steady, to work with purpose, to move through fear like it was just another tool to master. Hearing this, the carpenter walked home slower than usual. The cold air stung his eyes, but he didn't wipe the moisture away. Some truths were meant to be carried quietly, like a scar turned into strength. Over the next decade, the men aged into broader shoulders and lined brows. They built new workshops, trained new apprentices, forged new alliances. But the memory of the boy never dimmed. It merely changed shape inside them. The carpenter, now a mentor to many, passed on the boy's lessons without mentioning his name. Each young apprentice he guided carried a fragment of the legacy forged in that dangerous year. Still, some nights he returned to the hidden chest, pressing his palm against the floorboards as if hoping the portrait below could pulse with life again. It never did, yet the gesture grounded him, reminding him the past remained intact. When officials revisited the district after years of absence, their questions had softened, their interest dulled. The storm had passed, and the danger had receded into distant memory. But the carpenter remained cautious, shaped by the era's unforgiving lessons. A message eventually arrived from the distant guardian, carried through discreet channels. The boy, now a man, had become a craftsman, a builder respected for his discipline and quiet resolve. He had grown into the future they risked everything for. The carpenter read the message slowly, committing every word to memory before burning it like the last. The flames felt warm against his weathered hands, warming the ache that surfaced whenever he thought of the boy too long. The men gathered that night in the workshop, sharing silent toasts of gratitude. They never celebrated openly, but the weight lifted from their shoulders in a way that required no words, only shared glances of quiet triumph. Though they could never reclaim the years lost with the boy, they found solace knowing he carried their lessons forward. Brotherhood had transcended circumstance, carving its mark deeper than law or blood. The carpenter found himself carving the boy's emblem again, shaping the lines smoother, more deliberate. This time, he didn't hide it. He hung it above his workstation, letting every apprentice see the symbol of a courage once forbidden. Time eventually bent his back and slowed his hands, but his spirit stayed anchored to the memory of the son he once sheltered. Whenever apprentices asked about the emblem, he simply said, "A reminder that a man's duty is chosen, not inherited." Near the end of his life, the carpenter walked through the district one final time, passing places where danger once breathed down his neck. Yet now the streets felt gentler, softened by distance and change. He paused outside the workshop, staring at the doorframe he had reinforced the day officials threatened his world. Running his fingers along the wood, he whispered a quiet promise to the past. "We endured." Back inside, he knelt and lifted the floorboards one last time, removing the portrait from its hiding place. The faces stared back at him. For men and one boy, frozen at the moment, courage outweighed fear. He touched the boy's image, remembering the weight of a small hand gripping his coat the morning they first met. Some bonds don't fade. They settle into the bones and stay. The carpenter returned the portrait to its chest, sealing it with slow, reverent movements. He no longer feared it being discovered. Instead, he trusted that someday a man worthy of the truth would find it and continue the legacy. When he finally lay down that evening, the emblem glowed faintly in the lantern light, casting soft shadows across the workshop. The room seemed fuller somehow, as if the boy had returned for a final visit. The carpenter closed his eyes knowing the story wasn't ending. It was preparing for the man who would uncover the past and stitch its fragments into light once more. The legacy was waiting to be awakened. The historian carried the portrait into his study as though escorting a fragile witness long silenced by time. Every detail felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the men who once risked everything to protect a forgotten son. He arranged notes across the table, mapping names, dates, and faintly connected threads. Patterns emerged slowly, revealing a lineage shaped not by blood but by decisions grounded in courage, brotherhood, and the instinct to protect what the world condemned. The truth unfolded gently at first, then with striking clarity. The boy had survived, matured, and built a quiet life shaped by the lessons of the men who saved him. Their influence lived inside him, buried yet unmistakable. The historian traced the boy's adulthood through scattered documents, reading between lines the way a craftsman reads the grain of wood. Every subtle clue hinted at discipline, restraint, and the steady strength taught in that hidden workshop. He discovered the boy had become a respected tradesman in a northern city, known for mentoring lost youths much the way the carpenter once mentored him. Legacy had repeated itself, silently sculpting the next generation. One record mentioned a workshop emblem matching the design the carpenter carved. This single detail tightened the historian's chest, confirming the son carried the symbol as both shield and compass throughout his life. The historian visited the northern city, tracking remnants of the boy's life, streets he walked, tools he forged, brothers he trained. Each location hummed with an echo of the workbench where fear had first transformed into purpose. He eventually located a distant descendant, an aging craftsman whose hands bore the same steady patience the boy once learned. The man listened quietly, sensing the gravity behind the historian's visit before a word was spoken. The historian revealed the photograph, watching the craftsman's breath hitch as he recognized the youngest figure from family lore. Stories whispered across generations had hinted at a mysterious guardian, but none had explained the truth. With trembling hands, the craftsman admitted he'd inherited the wooden emblem, passed down with reverence, but never context. The historian asked to see it, and when he did, the symbol matched perfectly, proof of an unbroken chain of honor. They spoke for hours, trading fragments of knowledge that completed each other like mirror halves of a long-forgotten design. The craftsman learned the truth of his lineage. The historian learned the depth of the legacy he'd uncovered. The craftsman requested to meet descendants of the carpenter's comrades, hoping to honor the men who saved his ancestor. The historian promised to arrange it, feeling the story crossing from research into living reconciliation. He returned to the carpenter's old district, carrying news that would stir emotions buried across multiple bloodlines. The surviving families listened in solemn awe as he explained how their father's courage still shaped men alive today. An elder nodded through tears, recognizing the carpenter's carved emblem in the historian's description. He retrieved a hidden keepsake, a second emblem, carved by the carpenter himself, matching the one preserved in the northern city. This discovery forged an irrefutable connection between both families. The historian realized he was no longer documenting history. He was stitching lives back together, repairing fractures caused by secrecy and survival. A gathering was arranged at the old workshop, now restored by a preservation guild. Descendants from both lineages arrived with quiet anticipation, carrying tokens inherited from men who once forged a bond stronger than law. The historian placed the portrait on the central bench. The room hushed instantly, every man recognizing the magnitude of being face to face with ancestors whose bravery had shaped their existence. The craftsman approached the portrait first, tracing the outline of the boy whose survival allowed his own life to unfold. He whispered a vow of gratitude, promising to honor the legacy with the same loyalty shown a century earlier. A descendant of the carpenter stepped forward next, placing his hand over the boy's image with a reverence passed down through generations. His voice cracked as he thanked the historian for restoring a part of their identity long buried. The air felt charged with emotion, thick with the presence of men who had never met, yet shared a story bound by courage and sacrifice. In that moment, the portrait no longer seemed like an artifact, it felt like a living heartbeat. The historian spoke about the carpenter's decision, emphasizing how a single act of risking everything to protect a son outside his bloodline had shaped entire families. The room listened as though receiving a long-lost inheritance. The craftsman stepped to the front, revealing the emblem he carried. When placed beside the carpenter's original carving, the two symbols aligned perfectly, proving a continuity of purpose that transcended generations. Men exchanged embraces formed not by familiarity but by recognition of what their forefathers sacrificed so others could live, thrive, and build futures unmarred by the brutality of their era. The historian felt the weight of his role settle into pride. He had unearthed a truth that bridged time, restored honor, and brought descendants together to complete a story that began with danger and ended with gratitude. As the gathering continued, men shared stories passed down through families, some only fragments, others vivid recollections, but each threaded through with themes of resilience, mentorship, and the unwavering responsibility men feel towards sons who need them. A younger descendant lifted the portrait, marveling at how five faces captured a moment that had silently determined the course of their lives. He whispered that he finally understood the strength carried in his own lineage. The carpenter's descendant presented the craftsman with the second emblem as a gesture of unity. The craftsman accepted with a bowed head, understanding the symbolic weight of receiving something carved by the man who saved his ancestor. The historian stepped outside, needing a breath of cold air to steady himself. He looked toward the horizon, realizing the story had become larger than discovery. It was now restoration, healing, and truth finally allowed to breathe. The workshop door opened behind him, and both families stepped into the fading light, gathering for a new photograph. No laws forbidden them now. No fear restrained them. The moment felt like history correcting itself. They stood together as the camera clicked, capturing a modern echo of the portrait that started everything. This time, no one needed to hide. The truth lived openly, bound in brotherhood rather than secrecy. The historian watched the image develop, seeing strength, lineage, and connection blend into something timeless. It felt like the final chapter to a story written by men who acted long before he was born. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, he realized the original portrait had not been intended as proof of defiance. It was proof of love, loyalty, and the courage to stand against the world for the sake of a single child. He whispered a quiet thank you to the carpenter, the comrades, and the forgotten son, knowing their choices carved paths that shaped generations they would never meet, but somehow always protected. He placed the restored portrait beside the newly taken photograph, and the two images seemed to speak across time. A conversation between past and present, sacrifice and survival, fear and unbreakable devotion. The historian closed his notebook for the last time, recognizing he was not ending a story but passing it forward, allowing future sons to learn what it means to stand for one another when the world demands silence. And as he left the workshop, the emblems gleamed softly in the dusk, promising that the truth would never again be hidden, never again dissolved by fear, never again denied the light it had finally earned.